Picture this. A cold December morning in 1862. You're standing on the banks of the Rappahannock River in Virginia.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and there's this thick fog in the air. You can almost feel the anticipation.
Ooh, that's setting the scene.
Across the river, the town of Fredericksburg, it's in ruins.
Oh.
And on the heights beyond, you've got thousands of men. They're about to clash in a battle that is going to scar the nation.
Yeah.
This is the Battle of Fredericksburg.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pivotal moment in the Civil War. And today we are diving deep into it.
I'm excited.
It's a story that really shows like the transition from that kind of more traditional way of fighting wars to the brutal reality of total war.
Absolutely.
We'll be exploring the personalities, the decisions made, and the human cost. All the things that made Fredericksburg such a tragic turning point.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to be drawing from historian Greg Jackson's account.
Okay.
You know, his podcast, History That Doesn't Suck.
Yeah, great podcast.
So let's jump right in. First, let's meet the guy in charge of the Union Army of the Potomac, Major General Ambrose Burnside.
Mm-hmm.
He had just been appointed commander.
Okay.
And believe it or not, he was not happy about it at all.
Really?
Yeah, he actually tried to refuse command. Not once, but twice.
Wow, why? I mean, it must have been a ton of pressure on him to win. I mean, Lincoln was getting criticized. The public wanted to see the Union win.
You're absolutely right. There was immense political pressure to deliver a decisive victory, and they needed it quickly. But why would he refuse? Was he afraid?
Not exactly. He was actually really good friends with the previous commander, George McClellan, who Lincoln had removed.
Right.
So he felt super loyal to McClellan.
Okay.
And on top of that, he doubted his own ability to lead such a huge army.
So he was torn, right, between loyalty to his friend and this enormous responsibility that had been kind of thrust upon him.
Yeah. And that lack of confidence, that internal struggle, it ended up playing a huge role in what happened at Fredericksburg.
Okay, so Burnside, even with all these reservations, he comes up with this really bold plan. He wants to capture the Confederate capital, Richmond. So he wants to move the army quickly to Fredericksburg, and he's going to use pontoon bridges to cross the Rappahannock. It's a plan designed for speed and surprise.
And that element of surprise was crucial. The Confederates, led by Robert E. Lee, I mean, they were a force to be reckoned with. The Union needed every advantage they could get.
Absolutely. But those pontoon bridges, they ended up being a huge problem, didn't they?
They did. There were these logistical delays, which meant the bridges arrived late. That gave Lee time to reinforce his positions around Fredericksburg. The advantage Burnside had hoped for, gone.
And then to add to all of that, fog rolled in, blanketed the whole area. It created this eerie backdrop for the beginning of the battle.
Oh, wow. Can you imagine? Thick fog you can't see. Union engineers are trying to build these pontoon bridges, but they're under Confederate fire.
You can't see. Every shadow could be a sharpshooter.
It's true. The fog wasn't just, like, atmospheric. It was a real obstacle.
It's hard to imagine the courage it took for those men to keep working in those conditions.
Absolutely. But they were under immense pressure to get those bridges built and the army across the river.
When that fog lifted, Fredericksburg itself became a target. The Union bombardment of the town, it was devastating. Homes and businesses destroyed. Civilians were running for their lives. This is really one of the most striking examples of total war taking hold in the Civil War, isn't it?
Yeah. Up until then, there was almost this, unspoken agreement to, keep the fighting to military targets, to protect civilians and their property as much as possible. The bombardment of Fredericksburg was a big shift away from that.
It's a scary thought, blurring those lines between military and civilian targets.
Yeah. It led to a lot of resentment in the South, made them even more determined to fight. And it really raises those tough questions, How far is too far in war? What's justified?
So the stage is set. The bridges are built, and the battle begins. We've got two main engagements.
Yeah.
One's at the lower crossing right below Fredericksburg.
Right.
The other is up at Marie's Heights.
Okay.
That's a strategically important ridge overlooking the town. And these two engagements were completely different. The terrain, the tactics, everything.
Totally. At the lower crossing, you had fighting in the woods where Stonewall Jackson, he used layered defenses really effectively.
Stonewall Jackson, he was a brilliant military mind.
Oh, absolutely. But then at Marie's Heights, it was just this brutal frontal assault against Confederate positions. They were dug in behind that famous stone wall.
That stone wall, it became a killing field for the Union.
Yeah.
Confederate soldiers just unleashed this storm of fire from behind it. People described it as being almost like a machine gun.
Those stone walls gave the Confederates such good cover.
Right.
They were able to inflict really heavy casualties on the Union troops. It was just horrific.
It's hard to imagine the courage it took for those Union soldiers to keep charging into that wall of fire. Wave after wave just mowed down.
It's difficult to even think about, isn't it? But even in all that horror, there were still moments of humanity.
You're talking about Sergeant Richard Kirkland.
Yes.
Yeah, the Confederate soldier.
He risked his life to bring water to the wounded soldiers on both sides.
Yeah. It's a story that I think really reminds us of the human cost of war and the compassion that can exist even in the middle of that kind of brutality.
It's an incredible story. We'll come back to it in just a bit. But first, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back with more on the Battle of Fredericksburg. We'll talk about how it impacted the Civil War.
Yeah, it really is a remarkable story. Kirkland's compassion, right in the middle of all that carnage, it's something we should all remember. But let's get back to the battle itself. In the end, Fredericksburg was a big win for the Confederates and a devastating loss for the Union. It was a devastating loss. The numbers are staggering. Over 12,000 Union soldiers killed or wounded, compared to just over 5,000 for the Confederates. What led to such a one-sided defeat for the Union?
Well, there are a few things to think about. Burnside's leadership, for one. His plan was bold, maybe too bold, and the execution, well, it was flawed. Those logistical failures, especially the delay with the pontoon bridges, those played a big part. And then you've got the strength of the Confederate defenses. Lee and his generals, like Stonewall Jackson, they were masters at using the terrain to their advantage.
And speaking of questioning Burnside's leadership, one Confederate officer even said that Burnside could have searched the whole world for the worst place to attack, and he couldn't have found a worse spot than Fredericksburg.
Ouch. That's pretty harsh. But it does kind of reflect what a lot of people were thinking at the time.
So zooming out a bit, what did all this mean for the war? What were the wider implications of the Battle of Fredericksburg?
It was a turning point, strategically and psychologically. For the Union, it was a huge blow to morale. People had been expecting a quick win, and Fredericksburg, well, it made it clear this war was going to be long and bloody. It also fueled anti-war feelings in the North.
What about for the Confederacy?
It was a much-needed victory. It boosted morale, made them believe they could actually win the war. It also cemented Lee's reputation as a brilliant military mind. But even though they won, the Confederacy still suffered losses they couldn't really afford.
This feels like when that shift towards total war, the one we talked about before, really took hold. Bombarding Fredericksburg, destroying civilian property, it all points to a much more brutal kind of conflict.
You're right. The lines between military targets and civilian targets were getting blurred, and that had terrible consequences for both sides.
So all of this is happening in Virginia, but there was another key part of the war going on at the same time in the West, the Mississippi Valley. And Ulysses S. Grant, who we all know will eventually lead the Union to victory, he was facing his own challenges there.
Grant's goal was Vicksburg, Mississippi, the last Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. Whoever controlled Vicksburg controlled the whole river. And that was a vital artery for the Confederacy, for transportation and trade.
But Grant had more than just the Confederates to worry about, right? He had a rival in his own ranks, General John McClernand.
McClernand was, well, some might say egotistical, a politician turned general. He wanted to take Vicksburg himself without answering to Grant. And he actually had Lincoln's ear. He managed to get permission to raise his own army for the task.
So now you've got two Union generals, Grant and McClernand, both wanting control in the West. Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It could have been. But Grant, he was a smart strategist. He found a way to outmaneuver McClernand. He appealed to General-in-Chief Henry Halleck, made it clear that he, Grant, had authority over all the troops in his department, even those recruited by McClernand.
That's smart. So Grant basically stopped McClernand before he even got started.
Exactly. And with McClernand out of the way, at least for now, Grant could focus on his plan to take Vicksburg. He sent his trusted subordinate, William Tecumseh Sherman, to attack the city from the north.
Sherman. Now, that's a name you don't forget. He would later become infamous for his march to the sea, right?
That's the one. But at this point, he was still pretty unknown. But he was already proving himself to be a good commander.
So we've got Grant with Sherman attacking Vicksburg from the north. Meanwhile, Grant's also planning to strike the state capital, Jackson, to the east. It's a classic pincer move, divide and conquer. What could go wrong?
Well, the plan was sound, on paper at least, but the Confederates, their cavalry in particular, were not to be underestimated. Enter Nathan Bedford Forrest, one of the most feared and respected cavalry commanders of the war.
Of course, he was a brilliant tactician, a master of guerrilla warfare.
Absolutely. He and his men, they just tore through Union supply lines, disrupted Grant's plans, forced him to retreat in the end.
So even though Grant outmaneuvered McClernand, the Vicksburg campaign failed because of Confederate cavalry. It seems like the Union had setbacks on both fronts in late 1862.
They did. Fredericksburg and the failed Vicksburg campaign, those really cast a shadow over the North. The war was dragging on, the casualties were mounting, and nobody could see when it would end.
So 1862 comes to a close. Both sides are trying to recover and regroup. What was the mood like in the country at this point?
In the Union, there was uncertainty, a growing disillusionment. The Emancipation Proclamation went into effect January 1st, 1863. That was a huge event. But the military losses, they kind of dampened any feeling of celebration. The Confederacy, they'd won some important battles, but they were facing their own issues. They were outnumbered. They didn't have the resources the Union had. The war was hurting their economy, their manpower.
Sounds like both sides were starting to realize that this was going to be a long, hard war.
Exactly. That early optimism, that idea that the war would be over quickly, that was gone. The reality of total war, that was setting in. And it would change the course of the conflict and the nation for years to come. And it really started to shift right there at Fredericksburg. Those sacrifices, those stories of courage and compassion, they remind us of the real human cost of war.
It's hard to really grasp the human cost of this conflict. The sacrifices made by both sides. We read about battles in history books, but it's important to remember every casualty, that's a life lost, a family shattered. That's what makes history real, relatable.
It really is. Behind all those numbers, all the strategies and plans, there are these incredible stories of bravery and loss and people just trying to survive, like Sergeant Kirkland, bringing water to the wounded on both sides. Makes you think, what would he say about the war? About humanity in the middle of all that.
It really does. You almost wish you could go back and hear those stories firsthand. Speaking of going back, if you could go back to Fredericksburg and give advice to just one person, who would it be and what would you say?
Wow, that's a tough one. You know, I think I'd whisper to Burnside. I'd remind him that real leadership, it's not about trying to be a hero. It's about making those difficult choices, even when they're not popular. Or maybe I'd find a young soldier, doesn't matter which side, and I'd remind him to never lose hope. That even in war, there's still humanity.
That's a powerful thought. The battlefields at Fredericksburg might be quiet now, but what happened there, the lessons we can learn, those are still important today.
Fredericksburg reminds us of what happens when we're divided, the human cost of war. But it also shows us the strength of hope, the ability to keep going. It's a story that makes us think. It makes us want to understand. And hopefully it makes us want to work towards a future where this kind of tragedy never happens again. I hope this story stays with you long after this deep dive is over.
And for our listeners, if you're interested in these key moments in American history, make sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive. We'll keep exploring the past together. Thanks for joining us on this journey.